On episode 703 of the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast, we meet Dr. Raphel Cuomo and discuss his book, Crave, The Hidden Biology of Addiction and Cancer. Welcome to the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast, the largest and longest running health and fitness podcast dedicated to people over 40. Whether you're looking to lose weight, get stronger, or improve your health and age better, this podcast is for you. I'm your host, Coach Allan, an online health and fitness coach and author of the Wellness Roadmap. Each week, we dive into practical tips, expert advice, and inspiring stories to help you take control of your health and fitness. If you're ready to look, feel, and perform your best, no matter your age, this podcast is the perfect place to start. Let's get you on the path to a healthier, fitter, and more energetic version of yourself. I hope you'll join us each week, and together we can unlock your full potential. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast. I'm really glad you're here. It's pretty exciting times for me. My daughter is on the verge of having my first grandson. So I'll know a little bit more later today. But we're right at that point, so could be happening at any point in time. But this episode is going to go out today, and so not going to wait for it, but I'll be waiting for it for sure. But this episode will go live. I'd like to tell you a little story, though. In the early 1990s, Joanne was struggling to raise her daughter after a recent divorce. She was broke, unable to find work, and sinking into depression after losing her mother. She had every reason in the world to stay stuck. As an educated woman, most people in her position would have done the practical thing, found a job, any job. But Joanne made a different choice. She started writing the novel that lived in her head. Nothing in her life was ideal. It was not a good time to invest time and energy into something that might not ever earn her a dime. But she did it anyway. That's why we know her as J.K. Rowling, and that's why the world knows and has Harry Potter. This story reminds me about a health and fitness myth that runs rampant in the second half of each year. This time of year, the summer, I keep hearing the same words over and over. I don't have the time, money, or mental energy right now. They may say it slightly different depending on what it is that's keeping them stuck, but the meaning is the same. They believe it will be better in September. If, and that's a big if, you do actually start in September, it's very likely you'll quit when the holiday season hits. And for the same reasons you didn't start in July. I don't have the time, money, or mental energy right now. So when you do this math, you realize that you only show up for about 2.5 months, September through mid-November. Then it's, I'll start fresh in January. I call both of these periods of time the 6-week skips. But the ones who start in July, right now, they build serious momentum now. So they're way more likely to keep going through the holidays. They form better habits, they become better at consistency, and they get almost triple the results. Don't fool yourself into thinking you can hopscotch through the second half of the year and everything will just fall in place. There is no perfect time. There's only now. If you're ready to stop waiting and start building real momentum towards health and fitness through thick and thin, I'll help you create a plan that works. Just email me at coach@40plusfitness.com and let's get started. Our guest today is a professor of science at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine, whose research spans cancer prevention and addiction. He translates cutting-edge biomedical research into clear, practical insights about how behavior and biology shape long-term health. With no further ado, here's Rafael Cuomo. Dr. Cuomo, welcome to 40 Plus Fitness.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
You know, a lot of times I get a book and it's by a PhD, and it's diving into something like cancer or addiction or anything biology, anything. And I can pretty much expect, I do expect that that book is going to be upwards of 500 pages or more. If their publisher will let them do this, but they're thick and they're dense and they're packed with information. Thank you for not writing that book. This book is considerably shorter, but I would say packs a bigger punch.
Yeah,
There, there's
absolutely.
there's a lot in it because I'm reading through and I'm like, usually I get 20 pages in and I'm just finishing an introduction where they're talking about why they even care about biology. And now I know about their uncle and I know about a horse and I know about an autopsy. And I'm like, okay, I know all this stuff about them and their childhood and why they became a scientist, but I don't know anything more about the topic than I did 20 pages ago. That's not this. You got into it straight away. I was 20 pages into the book, and I'm like, I need to take a break and think because there's just there's so much to unpack in every single chapter, every single bit of this book, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
I appreciate you saying that. Thank you. Yes, I go right into it in the book. So, this is a book that merges several decades of clinical research with something everyone feels every single day, which is craving, right? We all crave. Sometimes we crave coffee, sometimes social media, sometimes validation or comfort food. The central idea of the book is that cravings are not purely psychological flashes. They become they can become biological programs that change inflammation, metabolism, and cancer risk. And so when we repeat a stimulus enough times, it rewires our cells as surely as it will rewire our habits.
Yeah, you used the phrase scar. I was thinking about tracks. Like it literally just builds a set of tracks in our brain and in our bodies, where this just almost it becomes so automatic we don't even think about it. We get home from work, we crack open the bottle of wine or open a beer, sit down on the couch to get comfortable to watch an hour or so of TV before we have dinner, and we know because we cracked that first one that there's probably going to be another one. And then there's probably going to be at least another hour of television or news or something after. And then we're going to go doom scroll for a couple hours before we sort of fall asleep.
Yeah.
And so we build these routines that aren't serving us. That's bad enough. It's bad enough if you've got a routine that isn't serving you. Not even if it's something that typically just wouldn't hurt you the way that like an alcohol addiction or drug addiction or something like that could hurt you. And we see it. We see people's lives end. As you mentioned, someone who died of a heroin overdose, but he was already dying. It was he already set the path. This was just something that accelerated him pretty quickly through that path. But you build these ruts. It's not just that. It's the social media. It's the television. It's the everything we're doing to basically cover feelings, cover mood, cover anything that's unpleasant. We build this effect of addiction to it, and it creates this rut that one is really hard to get out of, and then two, the downstream effects don't seem like okay. So I get on Twitter and I yell at people, or type yell at people for a couple of hours. So what? Um, that could be the thing that's breaking down my immune system that allows a cancer to fester and grow and kill me 15 years from now.
Yeah, I like to open with patterns because patterns are, I consider them the code of our lives. Think of brushing your teeth. You probably don't wake up and debate fluoride every morning. That action's pretty automated. And in the same way, cravings become habits, habits become patterns, and patterns sculpt, they determine your internal biology. So you can picture, for example, a single can of soda. Now that's pretty harmless, but now picture that soda every afternoon for 20 years. The human body responds by adjusting insulin signaling, by nudging liver enzymes, by shifting oral microbiota, and by raising systemic glucose exposure. And that is a textbook example of a micro pattern turning into a macro biology. In the book, I describe three kind of categories of everyday craving loops. So the first one is stimulant loops, right? Which include caffeine, energy drinks, nicotine, and including on social media, a constant feed of breaking news on our screens. And the second one is comfort loops, built around things like ultra processed food, alcohol, scrolling distractions, also on our screens. And the third would be achievement loops that reward overwork and sleep sacrifice. And I would add into that things like getting likes and such on social media. So, there are various sources of these three kind of categories of craving loops that we've become accustomed to. And these loops reinforce one another. You skip sleep after a deadline, you feel foggy, you drink extra coffee, you skip exercise, glucose spikes, you crave sugar, you push bedtime later again, and the cycle repeats. Every step feels like it makes sense in the moment, but in the aggregate, over time, this is pushing your body into chronic sympathetic dominance. Elevated heart rate, compressed breathing, and cell stress markers climb, which will raise your risk for cancer in the long term. A point a lot of people probably don't realize is that repetition can substitute for intensity, right? One cigar is a pretty intense single bad stimulus, but 5,000 lattes spread over 10 years, that might not sound like much, it's a latte, right? But the repeated cortisol and glucose oscillations can do measurable cellular harm over a long period of time. The epidemiology, I'm an epidemiologist, is very clear that habit frequency predicts health outcomes more reliably than one-time exposures. Another topic is timing. Circadian biology shows that cells expect light in the morning, darkness at night, and feeding windows to align with daylight. Late night snacking couples glucose spikes with melatonin peaks, which tells the pancreas to throttle insulin release. And over time, the mismatch teaches tissues to ignore insulin at night. This is invisible to us as we go through our lives, but it potently drifts us toward type 2 diabetes, which itself will raise risk for several cancers. A great lesson I've learned in public health, as you know, I'm a public health scientist, is that patterns are easier to design than they are to police. If a person stocks only whole foods in their kitchen, the environment nudges them toward more nourishing choices. You remove the cue, you remove half the battle. Quick story. Last year, I met a software manager who never considered himself at risk for cancer or chronic diseases because he jogged 3 miles a week, something like that. He sipped a sweetened coffee every 90 minutes during coding sprints, and continuous glucose monitoring revealed he spent 8 hours a day above 140 milligrams per deciliter. And it was that pattern which caused an elevated A1C. Once he compressed coffee to just 1 cup a day and replaced the rest of his caffeine intake with tea, his glucose curves flattened within 2 weeks. So I think that, these patterns that we live, they may not seem like they're causing something as serious as cancer, but they really do have a measurable biological effect over time. And our cells notice, right? Our cells take notice, our cells adapt, and it does strongly increase our risk for these terrible diseases.
Yeah, I like coffee. I'll fully openly admit I like to have coffee first thing in the morning. And then I do give myself 20 minutes to hop on X and see all the terrible things that are going on in the world. But then I'm off. And I'm fortunate because I have two dogs, and they will pattern interrupt in a minute. They don't care that I haven't finished that first cup of coffee. They don't care that I've only been sitting there on X for 15 minutes. When they're ready to go, they're in my business, and they're like, "Okay, come on," and I'm like, "Just 5 more minutes." Look, I got 5 more minutes, and they're back in one because they don't have watches. And but having something that kind of at least brings your attention to the pattern, I think is kind of has to be one of the most important steps, because these become our normal. I mean, it's not like we're sitting there thinking I'm doing these terrible things to myself, every day, every night. I'm having a couple cup of coffees in the morning. I'm looking at X in the morning, and then I'm walking to work, and then I'm sitting on my butt most of the day. Um, we don't think of those as patterns, but they are.
Right.
And if they're not serving us in our general health today, then the accumulative effect of this damages us. And sometimes that damage goes beyond what stopping can repair. Now our body is it's amazing. If you give it what it needs, it's pretty good at fixing itself, repairing damage, healing itself, getting better. Um, but we've got to catch these patterns and then slowly weed them out of our lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's critical to do. Attention. One thing I hope to do in the book is to raise awareness of the kinds of patterns people should be looking for. But once you have that kind of understanding, hopefully you take that understanding and start noticing where it is and how it is that you're engaging with these patterns. And beyond that, that you can move toward actually fixing these patterns, making them so that they serve your health rather than put you at risk for disease.
Yeah, I was thinking about my patterns before I left corporate, and when my health was it was better, but it wasn't great. It was okay. Get up in the morning, have some coffee, get in my truck, drive for an hour to work, and while I'm driving, I'm listening to voicemails, and I'm kind of planning my day. Okay, what am I going to do when I walk in the door? One of the things that would always happen on Friday, I was going to say it sometime, no, it was pretty much every Friday, there would be donuts in the break room.
Yeah.
Okay, and on Friday, I want to be double productive, because I don't want to have to work on Saturday. If I can get everything done on Friday that I should have probably gotten done the other 4 days of the week, then maybe I don't have to work as much on, or not work at all on Saturday. So I'm gonna go ahead and grab a couple donuts while I'm standing there talking to colleagues, and then if it comes around, I'll go back to the break room and get more coffee. If there's another donut, I grab another donut until the box is empty. Quite literally, because every time I'd go by, I was like, okay, I got coffee. Oh, there's still one more donut in there. Okay, I don't mind if I do. Um, it was a pattern, and it was a pattern that was happening every week, every Monday. I mean, every Friday, and it was a big part of my problem. It's not that 3 donuts were keeping me obese. It was that I wasn't giving my body what it needed: the movement, the good nutrition, the sleep, the stress management, to kind of break out of this pattern, and to basically let my body heal.
Yeah. So one thing I talk about in the book is metabolism. So we talk about metabolism. Metabolism is the orchestration of energy. Uh, we kind of sometimes a lot of people reduce it to just calories, but every hormone, every mitochondrial cycle, every micronutrient cofactor participates in this thing that we call metabolism. One key idea in the book I talk about is metabolic flexibility. Healthy cells flip between glucose and fatty acids, between carb oxidation and fat oxidation, depending upon what they need at that time. Craving loops us, traps us into a loop of metabolic rigidity. For example, constant grazing, as in your example, it forces insulin to stay high. And when insulin is high, hormone sensitive lipase is inhibited, So fat stores remain locked. Then, when a snack gap arrives, the brain can't access fat efficiently and signals hunger again. So that's not weak will, it's the metabolism, your pattern influencing metabolisms and your metabolism messing with you. Ultra processed foods intensify this trap by being low in protein and micronutrients, but high in refined starch. They fill you, but they fail to nourish you. So satiety hormones, they never fully register. You end up in a cycle of quick energy and quick crash. Over years, if you repeat that for several years, that volatility will hammer your mitochondrial resilience. And also, there's the mineral dimension. Magnesium, zinc, selenium are cofactors for antioxidant enzymes like something called glutathione peroxidase, which it has various different forms, but it's found throughout your body and in other mammals as well. Constant stress hormones deplete the magnesium and selenium and zinc through urinary loss. Deficient magnesium worsens insulin resistance and further elevates your stress hormones. And this loop just goes on and on and on over time, eventually resulting in something like cancer. People often ask sometimes whether weight alone indicates metabolic health, and the answer is no. It contributes, but it's certainly not the only factor. Plenty of lean individuals carry visceral fat, hepatic fat, or elevated triglycerides. A better indicator of metabolic health, I would say, is your triglyceride to HDL ratio. If your ratio is above 2, which means your triglycerides are over double your HDL, this often signals insulin resistance regardless of the scale weight. So there are two key reasons this matters for cancer specifically. First, excess insulin-like growth factor, IGF-1, encourages cell proliferation. And second, mitochondrial distress raises reactive oxygen species, which do direct damage to DNA. Couple these two things together, and you have a terrible recipe for cancer prevention because you have one that gives you more mutations and the other which gives you more internal proliferative signaling. So you don't have the mechanisms to kind of repair your cells after the DNA damage. That double hit is a textbook recipe for tumor initiation. I once met a marathon runner who had stage 2 colon cancer despite a normal body mass index. He actually had a habit of carbing up with gels and sports drinks 6 times a day. His colon cells experienced insulin and glucose spikes, surges equal to a sedentary soda drinker. His story illustrates for us that this activity alone doesn't immunize you from metabolic chaos. Obviously, it's very healthy, but if your fueling choices ignore insulin rhythm, that can be very unhealthy as well. So we have to be very cognizant of the habits that we get into that influence our metabolism because they are having a real impact on our risk for chronic diseases, especially cancer.
Quick question for you. Isn't there a third contributor in that a lot of cancers can only metabolize glucose and can't survive without it? So by having excess glucose in your system, you're effectively also providing the food to grow the tumor?
Right. So that is, that's a mechanism as well. And there are a lot of hypotheses about potential therapies like keto that might be beneficial for patients that have cancer, trying to kind of starve the tumor of glucose. And a lot of that research is still being done. But certainly when it comes to the promotion of kind of precancerous cells, precancerous lesions becoming larger tumors and metastasizing, that's certainly something influenced by high glucose as well as high insulin, right? Insulin like growth factor 1 is a very potent promoter of tumors and will cause cancer. We have these great mechanisms actually in our body that try to prevent us from getting cancer by repairing damage that may come across every day. But we short circuit a lot of those when our habits are not in line with what's healthiest.
Now, a big signaler, or I guess actually supposed to be a helper in when you do have a problem, is inflammation. Can you talk a bit about inflammation?
Absolutely. Let's dig into inflammation. You might hear, a person might hear that word and imagine something like a swollen ankle, right? Inflammation actually has two faces. One is acute inflammation, which is a necessary process for emergency healing, right? That's helpful, right? I was out the other day with my daughter. She, hit her leg, and now it's a little bit swollen. But I tell her, hey, that's part of the healing process, right? It's going to get inflamed a bit. You're going to be okay. Chronic inflammation is totally different. That is quite harmful. It keeps immune cells half engaged and misfire and do all kinds of terrible things, and it releases pro-carcinogenic cytokines like interleukin 6 and tumor necrosis factor. Most people don't realize how many modern cravings, modern day-to-day addictions, raise baseline inflammation. Excess fructose drives hepatic lipogenesis, which inflames the liver. Repeated alcohol binges open tight junctions in the gut, leaving bacterial fragments letting bacterial to slip into your blood and stoke an immune response throughout your body. And sleep loss can double C-reactive protein in the 48 hours after you've had a night of a low amount of sleep. So inflammation can be something that's self-propelling. Cytokines leak across the blood-brain barrier and raise microglial activation. And that gives you this kind of foggy, irritable morning mood you get after this night of doom scrolling and chips. It's not just fatigue, it's your brain chemistry actually being quite changed as a result of that inflammation. And that neuroinflammation feeds further craving by dampening something called dopamine tone. I have a whole chapter in the book about dopamine. So the brain is looking for another spike of dopamine. Cancer threads in here because tumors exploit inflammatory signals to recruit blood supply and hide from immune patrol. Epidemiologists like myself, we've seen that chronic inflammatory disorders, such as ulcerative colitis or hepatitis, they carry higher cancer incidence. Lifestyle cravings may not look as dramatic as hepatitis, but we will see the influence of chronic inflammation on cancer risk remains the same, even if you don't have a diagnosis of something like hepatitis or ulcerative colitis. There was one large study from the Karolinska Institute, which analyzed over 100,000 adults and found elevated C-reactive protein was associated with increased risk of several cancers. Particularly, they found it for lung and colorectal cancer, although the hypothesized mechanism would extend to a number of different cancers. Participants were
Now,
followed
the
for
C,
like
I'm sorry,
17 years. Yeah,
just for a second, I want to
sure.
be clear. The C reactive protein is a marker that you can actually get from a standard blood test, and it's basically an indicator of how much inflammation is going on in your body, the chronic inflammation, right?
That's absolutely correct. Yes,
Okay.
it's a great and a very commonly used biomarker for chronic inflammation. There are some others, but that's I think the one that's been studied the best. And yeah, so certainly yeah. And so in this study, they found that it was associated with increased risk for lots of different cancers, and they followed them for up to 17 years. So we really are talking about a marker that they monitored for a long period of time to really get at this chronic factor, the chronicity of it. And so, yeah, what they found is that while the very highest levels of C-reactive protein were most associated with cancer, they still found elevated risk for cancer even in people who had modest elevations of C-reactive protein. So one practical tip I tell people is to measure your resting heart rate if you want to know about your inflammation. Chronic inflammation nudges your autonomic nervous system toward sympathetic tone, okay, which would lift your resting heart rate. I'd say you want to keep your heart rate below 70. Anything above that is pretty suspicious. If you're an endurance athlete, it's gonna be much lower than that. And if you suddenly see it higher, you suddenly see something like 65 and you run all the time, that's still kind of suspicious. But most people, I would say, around 60 is fine. But if you get it above 70, that's something suspicious, and it could be indicating that you have chronic inflammation. Another tip a lot of people aren't aware of is looking at your gums in your mouth. Bleeding gums can signal endothelial irritation, and that often results from systemic inflammation. So certainly blood tests for CRP or homocysteine as well would be more precise measures. But if aren't going to go do that, you can get a sense of your chronic inflammation from your resting heart rate and also looking at your gums.
Okay. Now, this is sort of a side issue, but everything we've been talking about, it just always, I don't know, as I was going through all of this, I was like, this is also the start of autoimmune disease. This is also the start of autoimmune disease. This is also, it just seems like the hallmarks are they're just all the way through this. Do you mind talking a little bit about autoimmune disease, even though it's kind of off the path a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So autoimmune disease is your body's immune system essentially attacking itself, attacking your body. That is a very high level of this kind of idea of chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation is not something that's necessarily noticeable, but will in the long term cause cancer to have an increased risk for cancer. Autoimmune disease has also been associated with a number of different with increased risk of not just cancer but also things like cardiovascular disease as well. So a lot of these habits that we're talking about, these patterns we engage in, may contribute certainly to autoimmune disease, and we have found that people who get into healthier habits and establish healthy patterns, lose weight and exercise and eat healthy diets, they have a they can cure themselves of autoimmune disease, and also reduce the risk of cancer and heart disease as well. So a lot of these things are indeed interlinked. We have a lot of interlinkages here. I started off, decades ago studying cancer and looking at the biological underpinnings and the kind of biological mechanisms and molecular mechanisms for cancer cells and comparing them to healthy cells. And it became clear that these kinds of patterns were driven by behaviors. But then, I extended this reasoning. What are the behaviors driven by? They're driven a lot by our mindset, our habits, the habits that we get into. So I argue this in the book as well, that we need a new prevention, one that is upstream from behaviors, that looks into how we're coping with life and the kind of habits that we get into to cope and deal with life. And so one of the things I argue in the book is not just looking at behaviors and doing it or not doing it, but thinking about how we respond to the world, how we engage with the world that drives us into these day-to-day patterns.
Okay. So for someone listening to this is okay. I know I probably do all of these. Sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And so finding a pattern, particularly one that's existed for decades, can actually be quite difficult because we wouldn't even think of it as a problem. Even though it's basically, we know it, anything that you're using to escape reality effectively is probably one of these. I mean, that's one of the base rules I'd put out there. If you're doing it because you're trying to not feel something else or forget about something else, probably something to think about.
Yeah.
But how would someone be able to recognize one of these patterns and then be able to step in and start breaking that cycle?
Right. So I consider breaking the cycle to require three basic ingredients. The first is awareness. Okay. The second is friction, and the third is replacement. So I'll talk about each of these. So awareness, I would say, starts with information, right? First, knowing what factors are relevant, and so that's something I hope the book will help people do. But also awareness of course, your own personal habits. One thing you can do here is to keep what I call a craving diary for 72 hours. For a 72-hour period, write what you reach for, when you reach for it, and what emotion preceded it. Most people discover that the craving surge peaks about 90 seconds, right? You want something, and it's roughly 90 seconds after that that you really, really want it, and then that kind of just dissipates. If you ride that wave without acting on it, it passes. So having a sense of that number is very powerful because it does vary among people, but I would say roughly it's 90 seconds or so. The second ingredient is friction. Friction is any design that slows your impulse. If late night TV keeps you up and prevents you from getting sleep, maybe plug that television into a timer that, the timer switch that would cut off power to the TV at 10, forcing you to stop watching it, or at least making it harder for you because you have to get up and turn it on. If
Yeah,
convenience food
we
takes,
might have
yeah,
to put parental controls on our own phone.
yeah, yeah. So whatever makes it harder for you to do a bad habit, that's the second step here. So if you're eating a lot of ultra processed food at lunchtime, bulk cook protein on Sunday and make it really easy for you to just grab some of that healthy protein instead of going and getting a pastry at the coffee shop or something like that. And the last ingredient is replacement. Replacement is where the healing really happens. Instead of scrolling when stressed, stop yourself and do 20, 30 seconds of some deep breathing, right? Or a quick walk outdoors. Sunlight on the retina actually triggers serotonin release, and that naturally will counter your stress cravings. Okay, so obviously within moderation, getting sunlight exposure, but getting a little sunlight exposure going outdoors can help to eliminate that craving. For sugar cravings, maybe try frozen berries with some Greek yogurt or something, which gives you some protein, magnesium, calcium, instead of something that's refined and processed. So these are just examples, and people can experiment to see what works best for them. One thing I often suggest, if people are up for it, is a 7-day reset, which removes four common cravings: caffeine, alcohol, added sugar, and nicotine. The first 48 hours are typically really rough on people, right?
Yeah, I was
That's
like, you're gonna
two,
have
three
us do
days.
all
Yeah.
four of those. So for some people, quitting one of those would be, monumental, even if they were just going to do it for, I mean, 72 hours.
Yeah.
But all four at the same time, like cold turkey, just go.
It's rough. Yeah, so I would recommend building up to this. And
Okay.
maybe you do a couple days of a one or two, and then a couple days of the next. And eventually you build up to 7 days, kind of clearing your system. By clearing your system, I'm really more rewiring your neural circuitry to be able to resist those cravings and kind of experience a cleaner pattern of life. By day four, most people will report a steadier energy, clearer skin tone, improved ability to get to sleep. Again, it hardwires self-control, and you're able to reset your taste buds and reduce how much you want sugar, alcohol, caffeine, nicotine. But it can be rough, so you do build up to it. Breaking this cycle is really about engineering your life, designing your environment, so the healthy choice is convenient and harmful choices are actually more of a pain to do and something you don't really feel the need to engage with. Manufacturers sometimes they do the opposite for profit, and we can reclaim our bodies and our health by flipping that design.
Yeah. Just to kind of go back on that, for lack of a better word, fast, 72 hours. If it's something that you have actual chemical dependency to, so like nicotine and alcohol and sugar, people do have a chemical approach. I mean, there's brain chemistry related to that, so it's a little bit deeper than just craving an argument on Twitter,
Right.
if you will. Um, is 72 hours long enough for them to get past that, or is this just sort of a reprieve for a little while to maybe consider doing less of it? Or how does that typically work for someone that's trying to do this when there is that deeper addiction happening?
Yeah. Quitting cold turkey is very hard, and the first 3 or so days, I would say, are certainly the roughest, whether it's caffeine or nicotine or even added sugar. That's incredibly rough. I would suggest if you have had a long standing addiction, you try a day first for one of these, and then you try 2 days, then you try 3 days, you build up to it. And if you need some sort of crutch in the meantime, like nicotine, for example, super highly addictive. I wouldn't say necessarily it's a good idea for everyone who wants to quit nicotine if they consume a lot of it every single day to just stop cold turkey of all the four of these. Maybe you rely on a little bit more caffeine to get you through the nicotine addiction, and then you work on the caffeine. So this has to be individualized. But I would say the goal, if you can build up to it, is 7 days without any of these four, and that will really help you appreciate, the how to live life without being a slave to the cravings.
Yeah. Now, just a mindset question before we go on that. Um, this is not a yay, I made it to 7 day, woohoo, go back.
Right.
What mindset should someone have as they go into this? Because obviously, yeah, we're going to say, okay, this is just for 7 days. I can do anything for 7 days, but there's a point there where you're going to get to the seventh day, and we don't want all of this to basically be for naught. So what's the what do we tell ourselves as we get to that point to say, okay, we did this, we broke this cycle, and now I have control, and then to take that next step.
Right. So the idea here is that by the time you get to the end of the 7 days, you don't need any of these four. I mean, hopefully with nicotine, I don't think there's a reason for anyone to go back at all, or alcohol in moderation, I would say at most. But for things like caffeine, I would say there's nothing wrong with a cup of coffee, but it is wrong when you need it every single day, right? I had coffee this morning. I have no problem with people drinking coffee. The problem is when people feel like they absolutely have to have it, or else their life is going to just fall apart. Same thing with added sugar or any of these four. So after the 7 days, sure, go have a cup of tea, cup of coffee, maybe have a pastry, but hopefully that's something that's a nice treat and not something you absolutely have to have to live, to go through to get through your day. So it helps you think in a clear way about what you need in life, helps you go through life with a clearer mindset, and you have a better perspective on life and what you really do need in life.
Yeah, I one rule of thumb I've found is if there's a meme making fun of it, probably not something you should be doing. Like the I saw a sign in a bar. We were traveling a year or so ago around Panama, and in the bar down there, it said "Shut up, liver, you're fine." It was just because of the alcohol. But if, coffee. There's obviously all the coffee mugs of don't talk to me before so that we have these memes, these funny statements that have been built out around these patterns, and they're so normalized. Which was another thing that you got into in the book was these are not all these things that were like, oh, that's terrible, like a heroin addiction. He's just eating donuts, but it has the same internal, potentially the same internal damage effect over time because of the repetitive nature for a long, long time. But it's considered normal. Having drinks after work for a lot of people is just normal. That's what you do. And so this is one of those things where if someone's making fun of it, it's probably not funny. And we want to consider whether that's part of our lifestyle that's really serving us or whether it's something we need to change.
Absolutely. In the book, I kind of approach this problem of cravings in kind of two parallel ways. First, it's on the individual. For an individual, you have to be aware of your cravings. You have to try to think about them and try to figure out how to try to reduce your knee-jerk kind of need to scroll or have coffee or sugars and so forth. But also, I look at in the book about kind of the environmental aspect of things. So how society is structured, right? And there are certain policies like green spaces and workplace policies, giving people breaks, will be beneficial so that people can live better, have better mental health, take a breath, can go out and take a walk, and aren't necessarily going to need to have these cravings to get through the day. And as part of that as well, it's not just workplace and public policy, but also culture. How we treat people with these cravings. Sometimes we applaud people who get so much work done, despite the fact that they have been, completely just chugging caffeine and sugar and staying up late, and that's not necessarily the best approach, right? We want to encourage a healthy way of having people get through their work. We want to encourage healthier behaviors and not just these kinds of things that we make fun of in memes and so forth. So we have to if we really want to solve this problem, we do have to take individual responsibility, but at the same time, we have to recognize that there are social and environmental elements to this that we have to be cognizant of and, try to push to make better.
Excellent. Dr. Cuomo, if someone wanted to, I'm sorry, I forgot something. Uh, I define wellness as being the healthiest, fittest, and happiest you can be. What are three tactics or strategies to get and stay well?
Absolutely. And I love that definition. Um, my three tactics would be they're both simple and backed by scientific evidence. So the first would be guard the first 90 minutes of each morning. Light, movement, and protein within that window synchronize your circadian genes, stabilize glucose, and amplify mood for the rest of the day. So no phone, no urgent email, no stimulant until after real food. Second, every week you should schedule some kind of stimulus fast. That can be something small. For example, one full evening without internet, that might be a big deal for some people, but that's something people can try to do. Or one day without added sugar. Okay. These kinds of mini abstentions resensitize your dopamine receptors and make the rest of your week much more satisfying. And third, before you sleep, have a strict shutdown ritual. Dim lights, keep a cool temperature if you're able to do that. Have the same bedtime every day if you can do that. And I suggest perhaps a small magnesium-rich snack because some people find that that helps with relaxation. Deep sleep is the cheapest chemotherapy, the cheapest antidepressant, and the cheapest fat loss supplement all in one package. But it does demand that you have some respect for the ritual.
Absolutely. Dr. Cuomo, thank you so much for being a part of 40 Plus Fitness. If someone wanted to learn more about you and learn more about your book, Crave, where would you like for me to send them?
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to come on. If you know someone hasn't, if you haven't already, you can buy the book on Amazon. I know it's being carried by a lot of physical retailers, but I usually recommend Amazon because you for sure can get it there. If you read it and decide to tackle a craving, I encourage you to share your experience with friends and family and spread the goodness around.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next time on the 40 Plus Fitness podcast, we meet Dr. Kyra Bobinet and discuss her book, Unstoppable Brain, the new neuroscience that frees us from failure, eases our stress, and creates lasting change. Until then, have a happy and healthy week.